The morning sun cast long shadows across the vast prairie, painting the buffalo grass in hues of gold and amber. The wind carried whispers of sage and dust, sweeping endlessly across the untamed wilderness of the Nebraska Territory. It was the summer of 1868, and the frontier town of Willow Creek stood like a lonely sentinel against the endless expanse of the Great Plains. Sarah Mitchell pressed her palm against the small of her back, straightening from her work in the meager vegetable garden behind her weathered cabin. At 24, she bore the marks of frontier hardship in the premature lines around her gray eyes and the calluses on her work-worn hands. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hung in a simple braid, dulled by sun and constant toil. "Mama, I'm hungry," came the small voice from the doorway. Sarah turned to see her son, Thomas, clutching his favorite wooden horse. At 6 years old, he had his father's dark hair but her gentle eyes. Those eyes now looked at her with the patient hunger she'd grown too familiar with since James had died of fever the previous winter. "I know, sweetheart," she said softly, brushing dirt from her patched calico dress. "The cornbread will be ready soon." She had stretched their last bit of cornmeal as far as it would go, mixing it with more water than meal to make it last another day. The general store had refused her credit again yesterday. Being a widow in a frontier town meant being invisible at best, a burden at worst. The town itself was little more than a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered along a single muddy street. The saloon, the general store, the blacksmith, and a handful of houses made up the entirety of Willow Creek. Beyond that lay only the endless prairie, beautiful in its desolation, terrifying in its indifference. Sarah had just turned back to check on the meager cornbread baking in their cast-iron pot when she heard it, the sound that would forever divide her life into before and after. Hoofbeats. Not the familiar rhythm of a rider coming to town, but the thunder of many horses moving fast. Thomas heard it too. "Mama?" His voice carried a tremor of fear. The first scream came from the direction of the general store. Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She grabbed Thomas, pulling him inside the cabin. "Under the bed," she whispered urgently, pushing him toward their single room. "Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "But Mama, go!" The sharpness of her command sent him scurrying. Through the small window, Sarah saw them, warriors on horseback, their faces painted for war, moving through the town like a terrible storm. The raids had been getting worse since the railroad pushed further west, each side retaliating for grievances that seemed to multiply with every sunset. She heard glass breaking, wood splintering, the crack of rifles, misses. Henderson from 2 cabins down ran past, her bonnet gone, gray hair streaming behind her. A mounted warrior overtook her in 3 strides. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for James's old rifle above the doorframe. She'd fired it only once, at a coyote stalking their chickens. Her fingers fumbled with the ammunition. The door exploded inward before she could load it. 3 warriors entered, their eyes scanning the sparse interior. One was older, with scars marking his chest. Another was young, perhaps no more than 16. The third carried a war club dark with use. Sarah backed against the wall, the useless rifle clutched in her hands. One of them said something in a language she didn't understand, gesturing at her weapon. When she didn't move, he stepped forward and wrenched it from her grasp, tossing it aside like kindling. From beneath the bed came the smallest sound, a whimper, quickly stifled. But it was enough. The youngest warrior's eyes flicked toward the corner. "No!" Sarah breathed, then louder, desperately. "No, please!" She threw herself toward the bed, but strong hands caught her, dragged her back. She fought with the fury of a cornered wildcat, nails raking, teeth bared. The scarred warrior barked an order, and someone pressed her to the floor. She watched in horror as they pulled Thomas from his hiding place. Her son's eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his cheeks, but he didn't cry out. Brave boy, her brave, sweet boy. "Take me," she pleaded, though she knew they couldn't understand. "Please, take me instead." The younger warrior carried Thomas outside. Sarah's struggles intensified, animalistic sounds tearing from her throat. The scarred one looked down at her with something that might have been pity or contempt. She couldn't tell and didn't care. They bound her wrists with rawhide strips that bit into her skin. When they hauled her to her feet and pushed her outside, she saw Willow Creek burning. The general store was engulfed in flames. Bodies lay in the street. Some of her neighbors were being herded together like cattle, mostly women and children. "Thomas!" she screamed, searching desperately for her son among the captives. She caught a glimpse of him being lifted onto a horse, and then he was gone, swallowed by the chaos and smoke. They forced her to walk, hands bound, a rope around her neck connecting her to the other captives. Behind them, Willow Creek became a pillar of black smoke against the morning sky. Everything she had known, everything she had built with James, reduced to ash and memory. The march began under the climbing sun. Sarah stumbled over the rough ground, her thin boots offering little protection against rocks and thorns. The rope chafed her neck raw. When she fell, they hauled her upright. When she slowed, they prodded her forward. By nightfall, they had covered what felt like a lifetime of distance. The captives were allowed to collapse by a small stream. Sarah's throat was parched, her feet bleeding, but she barely noticed. Every thought was of Thomas, somewhere out there in the gathering darkness. It was then that they brought out the iron. Sarah watched in growing horror as they heated metal in the fire. The other women began to sob. She understood then. They would be marked, branded like livestock to show their status. When her turn came, they held her down despite her struggles. The scarred warrior pressed something cold and heavy around her neck. An iron collar, crude but effective. The weight of it seemed to press down on more than just her body. It was the weight of her new reality. Then came the burning. They marked her shoulder with a symbol she didn't recognize, the searing pain stealing her breath, her screams joining those of the other women. The smell of burnt flesh made her retch. As consciousness wavered, Sarah's last coherent thought was a prayer, not for herself, but for Thomas. Let him be safe. Let him forget this day. Let him somehow, somewhere, find a better life than the one she could no longer give him. The stars came out, cold and distant above the prairie. Sarah Mitchell, widow, mother, free woman, was gone. In her place lay something else. Property, marked and collared, beginning the first night of a captivity that would test the very limits of her will to survive. But even then, in the depths of her despair, a tiny flame refused to be extinguished. Somewhere in this vast wilderness was her son, and as long as she drew breath, she would find a way back to him. The coyotes howled in the distance, their voices carrying across the empty plains like a lament for all that had been lost when the sun rose that morning over Willow Creek. The journey into captivity stretched across 7 grueling days. Sarah's world had shrunk to the rhythm of forced marches, the bite of rope against raw skin, and the constant ache in her feet. The landscape changed from open prairie to broken country, where scrub pine clung to rocky hillsides and deep ravines cut through the earth like wounds. The iron collar had rubbed her neck raw, and the burn mark on her shoulder throbbed with each step. But physical pain was nothing compared to the gnawing emptiness where Thomas's presence should have been. She searched every group of captives they passed, every face, hoping against hope to catch a glimpse of her son. By the 8th day, they reached the main encampment. It sprawled across a valley beside a winding river. Dozens of buffalo hide lodges arranged in rough circles. Dogs barked at their approach, and children ran alongside, staring at the line of captives with curious eyes. Sarah was separated from the other women and taken to a lodge near the edge of camp. An older woman with gray-streaked hair and hard eyes waited there. She spoke harshly in her own language, gesturing at Sarah to sit. When Sarah was too slow to understand, the woman grabbed her arm and forced her down. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and misery. She was given the hardest tasks: hauling water from the river, gathering firewood, scraping hides until her hands bled. The work began before dawn and continued past sunset. If she slowed, she earned kicks or blows. If she fell, they hauled her upright and put her back to work. The food was scarce, usually a thin soup or piece of dried meat thrown at her like she was a dog. She ate with her hands, the iron collar making every swallow difficult. At night, she slept on the ground outside the lodge, a single worn blanket, her only protection against the cold. The other members of the band treated her as if she were invisible at best, or with open contempt at worst. Children threw stones when the adults weren't looking. Women spat as she passed. She learned to keep her eyes down, to make herself small and unremarkable. The language barrier was absolute. She picked up a few words through repetition: water, fire, work. But meaningful communication was impossible. She was utterly alone in a sea of hostility, marked by her collar and brand as something less than human. 3 weeks into her captivity, something shifted. Sarah was struggling with a heavy water vessel, her weakened arms trembling with the effort. She'd made this trip to the river 4 times already that morning, and her strength was failing. The path was steep and rocky, treacherous even for someone who wasn't exhausted and half-starved. Her foot caught on a root. The vessel flew from her hands, water cascading down the slope. She fell hard, knees striking stone, palms scraped raw. The precious water container rolled away, coming to rest against a boulder, cracked and useless. She stayed there on her hands and knees, breathing hard, waiting for the inevitable punishment. Breaking anything meant beatings. Wasting water was worse, but the blow didn't come. Instead, she heard footsteps approaching, different from the harsh stomps she'd grown accustomed to. These were measured, deliberate. She looked up to see a young warrior standing above her on the path. He was perhaps 25, tall and lean with the controlled grace of someone comfortable in his own strength. Unlike many of the others, his face bore no paint, and his dark eyes held something she hadn't seen directed at her since her capture, curiosity rather than contempt. He said something in his language, the tone questioning rather than angry. When she didn't respond, he frowned slightly and extended his hand. Sarah stared at it, confused. No one had offered to help her since she'd arrived. This had to be some trick, some new form of torment. But something in his steady gaze made her slowly reach out. His hand was calloused, but gentle as he pulled her to her feet. He examined her scraped palms with a clinical detachment, then looked at the broken water vessel. Without a word, he picked it up and gestured for her to follow him. Instead of returning to camp for punishment, he led her to a different part of the river, where the bank was less steep. He showed her an easier path, marked by flat stones someone had placed to form rough steps. Then he handed her his own water container and walked away without looking back. Sarah stood there, bewildered, watching his retreating figure. It was the first kindness she'd experienced in weeks, and she didn't know what to make of it. She saw him again the next day, and the next. He never spoke to her directly, but she began to notice things. When her food portion was especially meager, extra pieces of dried meat would appear near where she slept. When her worn blanket finally fell apart, a newer one mysteriously replaced it. Once, when a group of young boys cornered her with stones, he appeared and sent them scattering with a few sharp words. She learned his name from listening to others. White Crow. They called him. He was respected among the band, known for his skill with horses and his prowess as a hunter. Why he had taken notice of her, she couldn't fathom. The moon had gone through a complete cycle when the incident with the firewood happened. Sarah had been gathering wood all afternoon, her back aching from the constant bending. The basket was nearly full when 3 women from the band approached. She recognized them. They often made her life particularly miserable, finding extra work for her or, accidentally, knocking over things she'd just cleaned. They spoke rapidly, gesturing at her basket. When she didn't move fast enough, one of them upended it, scattering the carefully gathered wood across the ground. They laughed, saying something that was clearly mocking, and walked away. Sarah stared at the scattered wood, something inside her finally snapping. She was tired, so deeply tired, of the abuse, the hunger, the constant degradation. Her hands clenched into fists, and she had to bite her lip hard to keep from screaming. She didn't notice White Crow's approach until his shadow fell across the scattered firewood. He looked from the wood to her face, reading the situation in a glance. This time, when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of anger, not directed at her, but at the retreating women. He helped her gather the wood, working in silence beside her. When the basket was full again, he carried it back to camp himself, making sure the women who had tormented her saw him do it. The message was clear, even if Sarah didn't fully understand it yet. That night, as she curled up in her usual spot outside the lodge, she found not only food, but a small leather pouch containing a healing salve. She applied it to her scraped hands and the raw spots where the collar rubbed, tears sliding down her cheeks at this unexpected mercy. She thought of Thomas constantly during those long nights. Where was he? Was someone showing him similar kindness? Or was he suffering as she was? The not knowing was its own form of torture. Sometimes she dreamed of him, only to wake to the crushing reality of his absence. As autumn approached and the nights grew colder, Sarah noticed White Crow watching her more often. There was something in his gaze that went beyond simple kindness, a growing conflict, as if he were wrestling with some internal battle. She didn't understand then that in his world, she represented everything his people had lost. The encroachment of settlers, the broken treaties, the vanishing buffalo, all of it was embodied in her pale skin and light eyes. To show her kindness was, in some ways, a betrayal of his own people's suffering. Yet he continued to help her, these small acts of mercy the only light in her darkness. And Sarah, despite everything, found herself looking for him each day, this young warrior who saw her as something more than a branded captive. She didn't yet know that his kindness would cost them both dearly, or that the fragile connection forming between them would soon be tested by laws and hatred neither of them could escape. For now, there was only survival, one day at a time, and the small hope that somewhere in this vast wilderness, her son still lived and remembered her face. The storm came without warning on a night when the moon hid behind thick clouds. Sarah had learned to read the weather in her months of captivity, but this tempest arrived with a violence that caught even the band members off guard. Thunder crashed overhead like artillery fire, and rain fell in sheets so dense she could barely see 3 feet ahead. She huddled against the base of a cottonwood tree, her thin blanket already soaked through. The iron collar seemed to draw the cold, sending chills deep into her bones. Around her, the camp was in chaos, lodges straining against the wind, people shouting, horses whinnying in fear. Sarah had been working since before dawn, hauling extra water in preparation for a ceremony she didn't understand. Her body, already weakened by months of hard labor and poor food, had nothing left to give. The cold rain felt like needles against her skin, and she found herself sliding down the tree trunk, her legs no longer able to support her. The mud was cold beneath her cheek. She tried to push herself up, but her arms buckled. This was how it would end. Then, not with violence or cruelty, but with simple exhaustion in a storm. Part of her welcomed it. The pain would stop. The endless, gnawing worry about Thomas would finally cease. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her. Strong arms lifted her from the mud, through the haze of near consciousness. She smelled wet buckskin and wood smoke. White Crow. Even half dead, she recognized his presence. He was speaking, his voice urgent, but the words were lost in the storm's roar. He carried her swiftly through the rain, not toward the main camp, but to a smaller lodge set apart from the others. Inside, blessed warmth hit her like a physical force. A fire crackled in the central pit, and dry buffalo robes covered the ground. White Crow laid her down gently near the fire, his movements efficient but careful. He spoke again, and this time she caught the concern in his tone. Her eyes fluttered open to find him kneeling beside her, water dripping from his hair. He gestured at her soaked clothing, then turned his back in a gesture of respect, with trembling fingers. Sarah peeled off the worst of the wet fabric, wrapping herself in a dry blanket he'd left within reach. The warmth was almost painful against her chilled skin. When she made a small sound to indicate she was covered, He turned back and handed her a cup of something hot. Tea, she realized, made from herbs she didn't recognize. It burned going down, but warmth spread through her chest, pushing back the deadly cold. He tended the fire, adding wood until the flames leaped high. Then he sat across from her, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that would have frightened her months ago. Now, she simply stared back, too exhausted for fear. "You should not die like this," he said. Sarah nearly dropped the cup. He had spoken in English, accented and careful, but unmistakably English. You speak." Her voice was hoarse from disuse. "Little," he said, holding up his hand with fingers barely apart. "Learn from traitors, from soldiers, before the wars, before the raids, before everything fell apart." "Why?" she whispered. "Why help me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the fire. "You have child," he said finally. "I see in your eyes. Same look my sister had when they took her children to the white school. She never saw them again." Sarah's throat tightened. "My son, Thomas, he's only 6. He lives," White Crow said simply. "With another band, I hear of white boy with dark hair. They will not harm him. Children, they adapt, become part of the people, in time." The relief was so intense she nearly sobbed. Thomas was alive. That was all that mattered, even if she never saw him again. He lived. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you for telling me." White Crow nodded, then gestured around the lodge. "This was my brother's. He died last winter, sickness from the agency blankets. No one uses it now." He paused, seeming to wrestle with his words. "You stay here tonight. Storm is bad. You die out there." "They'll punish you," Sarah said. She'd learned enough about the band's strict rules to know that helping her this way crossed dangerous lines. His jaw tightened. Let them try. He rose to leave, but Sarah found herself reaching out, her fingers barely brushing his arm. He froze at the contact. "Why?" she asked again. "The real reason." He turned back, and for a moment his carefully controlled expression cracked. She saw pain there, and loneliness, and something else, something that matched the strange flutter in her own chest when she looked at him. "You do not look at me with hate," he said quietly. "Even with—" He gestured at her collar, her brand. "Even with this, you do not hate. That is rare." He left before she could respond, disappearing into the storm. Sarah sat by the fire, his words echoing in her mind. She thought she had hidden her growing feelings, buried them beneath layers of gratitude and survival instinct. But he had seen. Somehow, he had seen. The storm raged through the night, but Sarah slept warm and dry for the first time in months. When morning came, bringing weak sunlight and dripping trees, she expected to be dragged back to her usual spot, punished for accepting shelter. Instead, she found White Crow waiting outside the lodge with 2 horses. "The old woman who keeps you is angry," he said without preamble. "Says you are lazy, worthless, says you bring bad spirits." Sarah's stomach dropped. She had seen what happened to captives deemed too troublesome, traded away, killed, or worse. "I told them I would take responsibility," White Crow continued. "You work for me now, care for horses, fix leather, cook." He paused, then added quietly, "Is better than before." It was. The work was still hard, but it was work she knew. Her father had kept horses back in Ohio, before she'd married James and headed west. She knew how to curry them, how to check their hooves, how to sense their moods. More importantly, she was away from the casual cruelty of the main camp, White Crow's lodge, for she learned he had moved back into it. Giving her his brothers, sat at the edge of the encampment. Here, she could almost pretend she wasn't a captive. Almost. The collar still circled her neck. The brand still marked her shoulder. And increasingly, members of the band watched White Crow with suspicious eyes. "You risk too much," she told him one evening as they worked side by side, repairing a torn saddle. Her English had become rusty from disuse, but speaking it with him felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. "My choice," he replied, not looking up from his work. "They whisper about you, about us." His hands stilled. "You understand their words now?" Enough." She had been listening, learning, picking up more of the language each day. "They say you forget who you are, that you shame your brother's memory." "My brother would understand," White Crow said firmly. He believed in honor. Is there honor in starving a woman who has done no wrong to us, in marking her like an animal? Sarah touched the collar unconsciously. "Your people have been wronged too. I understand their anger." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "This is why," he said softly. "This is why I help. You see both sides. Most cannot, most will not." As autumn deepened, their strange partnership settled into a rhythm. Sarah tended the horses and prepared his meals. White Crow ensured she had adequate food, warmer clothing, and protection from the worst of the band's hostility. They worked together in companionable silence, and in the evenings, he would practice his English while she learned words in Dakota. It was during one of these evening lessons that everything changed. Sarah was struggling with pronunciation, making White Crow laugh, a rare sound that transformed his usually serious face. She laughed too, and for a moment, the reality of their situation fell away. They were simply two people sharing a moment of joy. Their eyes met across the fire, and the laughter died. White Crow reached out slowly, his fingers barely touching the iron collar at her throat. "This is wrong," he said, his voice rough. "All of it. Wrong." "Yes," she whispered. His hand moved to cup her cheek, and Sarah leaned into the touch despite herself. How long had it been since someone had touched her with gentleness, since she had felt like a person rather than property? The sound of approaching voices shattered the moment. White Crow pulled back sharply, his face closing off. 3 warriors entered without announcement, a breach of etiquette that spoke of serious purpose. They spoke rapidly in Dakota, their voices hard and accusing. Sarah caught enough to understand they had come to warn him. The chief was displeased. There were rules, sacred laws that governed the people. He was walking a dangerous path. White Crow listened in stony silence, then responded with equal firmness. Whatever he said made the warriors exchange dark looks. One of them pointed at Sarah, spitting words that needed no translation. After they left, White Crow sat motionless, staring into the fire. "What will you do?" Sarah asked quietly. He was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "What my heart tells me is right," he said, "even if it costs everything." Sarah wanted to tell him not to throw away his life for her. She wanted to be noble, to insist he follow his people's ways. But the words wouldn't come, because in her heart, she knew the truth. She didn't want to lose him. This man who had saved her not just from death, but from despair. Who saw her as human when everyone else saw only an enemy to be broken. "You do not deserve this life," he said suddenly, fiercely. "You deserve to be free, to find your son, to live without chains." "We don't always get what we deserve," Sarah replied. "No," White Crow agreed. "But sometimes we must take it anyway." The whispers had become roars. What began as sideways glances and muttered words had grown into open hostility that followed White Crow wherever he went. Sarah watched from the edge of camp as other warriors turned their backs on him, as women pulled their children away when he passed. The man who had once commanded respect was becoming an outcast, and they both knew why. 3 moons had passed since the night of the storm. 3 moons of working side by side, of stolen moments and careful distances. 3 moons of pretending that what was growing between them could remain hidden. But nothing stayed secret long in the close confines of the band. And Sarah's improved condition, the fuller cheeks, the warmer clothes, the absence of fresh bruises, told its own story. Chief Standing Bear was an old man, his face carved by decades of sun and struggle. When he summoned White Crow to his lodge, the entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Sarah waited outside White Crow's lodge, mending a bridle with trembling fingers. straining to hear raised voices that didn't come. The silence was somehow worse than shouting would have been. White Crow returned as the sun touched the western hills, his face a mask of controlled fury. "What did he say?" Sarah asked, though she feared the answer. "I am given a choice," White Crow said, his voice flat. "Send you back to the woman who owned you before, or face judgment before the council. The chief reminds me of our laws. No warrior may claim an enemy woman as anything more than a slave. To treat you as—" He paused, jaw tightening. "To treat you as I have breaks sacred traditions." "Then send me back," Sarah said quickly. "I survived before. I can—" "No." The word came out sharp as a blade. "You barely survived. You were dying when I found you in that storm. Better that than—" "Then what?" He turned to face her fully, and the mask slipped. She saw raw emotion in his eyes, anger, fear, and something deeper. "Then watching them destroy you slowly, then knowing I could have prevented it and chose not to? They'll destroy you instead," Sarah whispered. "Your own people will turn against you. You'll lose everything." "I have already lost much," White Crow said quietly. "My parents to the spotted disease, my brother to poisoned blankets, my sister's children to the white schools. What is left to lose?" "Your life," Sarah said. "Your place among your people. Your honor. There is no honor in cruelty." He interrupted. "My grandfather taught me that strength means protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The color of your skin does not change this truth." That night, Sarah barely slept. She lay on her buffalo robe, staring at the smoke hole above, wrestling with thoughts that chased each other in circles. She could run, but where? The collar marked her as property, and she had no idea which direction led to safety. She could submit to being returned to her previous owner, but White Crow was right. She had been dying by degrees under that woman's harsh hand. Or she could stay and watch the man who had saved her face punishment for his compassion. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A hunting party from another band arrived, bringing news that set the camp buzzing. They spoke of soldier movements to the south, of new forts being built, of treaties broken before the ink dried. But Sarah heard only one piece of news, delivered almost as an afterthought. A white boy with dark hair lived with the Fox River Band, adopted by a childless couple who treated him as their own son. Thomas. Her Thomas was being cared for, even loved. The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by a sharp pang. He was adapting, as White Crow had said children do. How long before he forgot her face, her voice, the lullabies she used to sing? White Crow found her behind the lodge, tears streaming down her face. "He is safe," he said gently. "This is good. He's forgetting me." Sarah choked out. "I'm becoming a ghost to him. Memories can sleep without dying," White Crow said. "When you find him again, they will wake." "When?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "How can I find him when I can't even find myself? When I'm marked and collared like livestock?" White Crow was quiet for a moment. Then he knelt beside her, his hands gentle but firm as they examined the iron collar. "This comes off," he said decisively. "Tonight. The chief." The chief gave his warning. Now I give my answer. As darkness fell, Sarah found herself the center of a ceremony she didn't fully understand. White Crow had called upon his cousin, a man who worked metal for the band. Together, they built a hot fire away from the main camp. The work was dangerous. One slip of the tools could severely injure or kill her. But White Crow's hands were steady as he supported her neck, murmuring reassurances while his cousin carefully worked at the collar's locking mechanism. It took hours. Sarah's neck was rubbed raw, and more than once she had to bite back cries of pain. But finally, with a sound like breaking bones, the collar split and fell away. Sarah's hand flew to her throat. For the first time in nearly a year, she could touch her own skin there. The feeling was so overwhelming she swayed, and White Crow caught her. "Now the mark," he said, gesturing to her shoulder where the brand still showed. "It's permanent," Sarah said. "Nothing can remove it." "Not remove," White Crow corrected. Change. Cover. Make new. She didn't understand until he showed her the small pot of ink and the bone needles. Tattooing, she realized. He meant to cover the slave mark with something else. It will hurt, he warned. Sarah almost laughed. What was pain compared to what she had already endured? Do it, she said. By firelight, White Crow worked. His design was intricate, a white crow in flight, wings spread wide, breaking free from bonds below. It was beautiful and painful and perfect. When it was done, Sarah's shoulder throbbed, but the slave mark was hidden beneath something that spoke of freedom rather than captivity. Now you are marked by choice, White Crow said softly, not by force. The intimacy of the moment, his hands on her skin, the care in his touch, the symbol he had chosen, overwhelmed the last of Sarah's defenses. When he finished, she turned to face him fully. Why a white crow? She asked. Because they are rare, he said. Different, set apart, but still they fly. Their eyes met and held. Sarah saw her own feelings reflected there, the longing, the impossible hope, the recognition of something that transcended all barriers between them. Slowly, as if drawn by invisible threads, they leaned toward each other. The kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, a question asked and answered. When they parted, Sarah saw wonder in his eyes that matched her own. This is not wise, he murmured, even as his hand cupped her cheek. No, she agreed. It's not. But wisdom had little to do with the human heart. They kissed again, and this time there was nothing hesitant about it. Years of loneliness, months of careful distance, all dissolved in that moment of connection. When they finally returned to camp, dawn was breaking, and Chief Standing Bear was waiting for them. He took in Sarah's bare neck, the fresh tattoo visible where her dress had slipped from her shoulder, the way she and White Crow stood together. His weathered face showed no surprise, only deep disappointment. You have chosen, he said to White Crow and Dakota. Sarah understood enough to follow. The council will meet when the sun is high. You know the law. I know it, White Crow replied steadily. And I reject it. The law that makes slaves of women and children is no law worth following. The chief's expression hardened. Then you reject your people. I reject cruelty disguised as tradition, White Crow said. My people, the people my grandfather taught me to be, would not recognize what we have become. Standing Bear turned his ancient eyes to Sarah. And you, white woman, do you know what you have cost him? Sarah lifted her chin. I know what he has given me, she said in careful Dakota. Life, hope, humanity. I would not dishonor his sacrifice by refusing it. The chief studied them both for a long moment. Then he spoke the words that would change everything. When the sun sets tomorrow, if you remain in this camp, you will both face judgment. The woman as a runaway slave, the warrior as a traitor to his people. This is the law. He turned and walked away, leaving them standing in the morning light. Around them, the camp was stirring to life. People emerged from lodges, saw them standing there, and quickly looked away. They were already ghosts to their own people. We have one day, White Crow said quietly, to prepare, to run, to disappear. Sarah felt the weight of what they faced settling on her shoulders. But when she looked at White Crow, this man who had chosen her freedom over his place among his people, she felt something else too. Not just gratitude or affection, but love. Deep, impossible, dangerous love. Then we'd better make it count, she said. The die was cast. The sacred laws had been broken. Tomorrow's sunset would find them fled or dead. But for now, in this moment, Sarah Mitchell was no longer a slave. The collar was gone. The mark was covered. And beside her stood a man who had sacrificed everything to ensure she could reclaim her humanity. Whatever came next, she would face it as a free woman. And she would not face it alone. The night came too quickly. Sarah worked beside White Crow in tense silence, gathering only what they could carry: dried meat, water skins, ammunition for his rifle, a knife, 2 blankets. Every item had to be chosen carefully. Too much would slow them down. Too little would mean death on the prairie. White Crow had selected 2 horses from his string, a paint mare known for endurance and a sturdy bay gelding. He packed them with practiced efficiency, while Sarah filled the water skins at the creek one last time. The camp around them pretended not to notice their preparations, but she felt eyes watching from every lodge. "Where will we go?" she asked as they worked. "North first," White Crow said quietly. "Then west toward the mountains. There are places where neither my people nor yours venture, hard places, but safe." "And Thomas?" He paused in his packing. "The Fox River Band winters near the Yellowstone. When we are settled, when pursuit has ended, we will find a way." It was a slim hope, but Sarah clung to it. The thought of Thomas was the only thing that could make leaving feel like something other than pure flight. As the moon rose, White Crow's cousin appeared from the shadows. He handed White Crow a parfleche bag without speaking, then gripped his shoulder briefly before melting back into the darkness. Small acts of support that could be denied later if questioned. They led the horses quietly to the edge of camp, moving like shadows themselves. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every snapped twig sounded like thunder. Every distant dog bark made her freeze, but they cleared the camp's perimeter without alarm being raised. Then they mounted and rode. The first hours were a blur of darkness and speed. White Crow led them along paths Sarah couldn't see. Guided by knowledge born from a lifetime on this land, they splashed through streams to break their trail, doubled back through rocky ground, used every trick to confuse pursuit. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 20 miles. White Crow called a halt in a grove of cottonwoods, where a small spring bubbled up from the rocks. The horses were lathered with sweat, their sides heaving. "We rest here briefly," he said, helping Sarah down. Her legs nearly buckled. She hadn't ridden hard in over a year, and her body protested the sudden demand. They watered the horses and themselves, ate a handful of dried meat. Sarah wanted to collapse, but White Crow shook his head. "Not yet. They will discover us gone with the morning light. We need more distance." So they rode on as the sun climbed. The landscape changed from rolling prairie to broken badlands, painted in reds and grays. It was beautiful in its desolation, but Sarah barely saw it. All her focus was on staying in the saddle, on watching their back trail for signs of pursuit. It came at midday, a dust cloud on the horizon, moving fast. "How many?" Sarah asked, though her throat was almost too dry to speak. White Crow studied the distant cloud with narrowed eyes. 6, perhaps 7. Warriors, not the whole band. They mean to catch us and bring us back for judgment." "Can we outrun them?" "No, but we can outlast them." He turned his horse toward a maze of canyons to the west. "Follow close. Do exactly as I do." The next hours were a nightmare of hard riding through increasingly difficult terrain. They plunged down steep slopes where one misstep meant a broken neck. They squeezed through passages so narrow the horses' sides scraped stone. They jumped dry washes and scrambled up crumbling ridges. But their pursuers were skilled too, and they knew White Crow's ways. The gap slowly closed. As the sun began its descent, White Crow led them up a particularly treacherous path to a mesa top. There, ancient winds had carved the stone into fantastic shapes, arches and pillars and balanced rocks that looked ready to topple at a breath. "Here," he said, dismounting quickly. "We make our stand here." "Stand?" Sarah slid from her horse, legs trembling. "We can't fight 7 warriors." "We don't fight," White Crow said. "Already working. We convince them the cost is too high." He positioned their horses behind a wall of stone, then began arranging their few supplies. His rifle he placed where it would be visible. The parfleche bag his cousin had given him, he opened carefully, revealing something that made his face tighten: his war shirt, his honors, the symbols of his status as a warrior, things he could never wear again among his people. "Help me," he said, and together they created an illusion, blankets arranged to look like bodies from a distance. the rifle positioned to suggest a defensive position. Even Sarah's torn dress sleeve tied to a stick like a flag of defiance. Then White Crow led her to a hidden cleft in the rocks, a place where erosion had created a narrow cave. "Whatever happens, you stay here," he said urgently. "Do not come out. Do not make a sound." "What are you going to do?" He touched her face gently. "What I must to keep you safe." Before she could protest, he was gone, moving among the rocks like a spirit. Sarah pressed herself into the shadows of the cleft, barely breathing, as the sound of horses grew closer. She heard voices calling, challenges in Dakota that echoed off the stone. Then White Crow's voice, answering from somewhere among the pillars. The warriors had dismounted. She could hear their careful movements as they approached what they thought was a fortified position. White Crow appeared suddenly on a high pinnacle, silhouetted against the dying light. He wore his war shirt now, eagle feathers in his hair, his face painted as if for battle. He looked magnificent and terrible and utterly alone. He spoke in Dakota, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Sarah understood enough to follow. He invoked his rights as a warrior, his honors earned in battle, his blood shed for the people. He spoke of laws older than the ones they followed now, laws of mercy, of protection, of a warrior's right to choose his own path. "I claim the ancient way," he declared. "Single combat for my freedom and hers. Who among you will face me?" There was stirring below. Heated discussion. These warriors had ridden with White Crow, fought beside him. They knew his skill, and he had invoked old laws, older than Standing Bear's rules about captives. Finally, one stepped forward, a young warrior named Red Sky, ambitious and eager to prove himself. The others formed a circle among the stone pillars, creating an arena of sorts. White Crow descended from his perch, moving with deadly grace. He had only his knife against Red Sky's lance, but Sarah had seen him train. He was faster than lightning, fluid as water. The combat was brief, but vicious. Red Sky charged with his lance. White Crow twisted aside at the last second, the lance point scraping stone where he'd been. Before Red Sky could recover, White Crow was inside his reach, knife flashing. Not to kill, he could have easily, but to disarm, to humiliate. The lance went flying, and Red Sky found himself on his back with White Crow's knife at his throat. "Yield," White Crow said quietly. "There is no shame. You fought with honor." Red Sky yielded. White Crow helped him to his feet, even embraced him briefly. The other warriors looked uncertain now. The old laws had been invoked and satisfied, but their orders from Standing Bear were clear. An older warrior, Grey Wolf, stepped forward. Sarah recognized him as White Crow's former mentor, the man who had taught him to track and hunt. "You have won your combat," Grey Wolf said heavily. "But you cannot win against all of us, and we cannot return without you. Come back, accept judgment. Perhaps the council will show mercy." "We both know what mercy the council will show," White Crow replied. "To her, none. To me, perhaps exile instead of death. But I will not watch her be returned to slavery. I will not stand by while—" He stopped, his head turning sharply. Sarah heard it too. Horses, many horses, approaching fast, but not from the camp's direction, from the east. "Soldiers," one of the warriors breathed. A cavalry patrol, perhaps 20 men, drawn by the dust and commotion. They appeared on the plain below like blue-coated ghosts in the twilight. Sarah's heart leaped with wild hope, then plummeted. Soldiers might mean rescue for her, but they would likely shoot White Crow on sight. The warriors melted back into the rocks, torn between their mission and the need to avoid the soldiers. White Crow stood alone in the open, watching the patrol approach. "Go," Grey Wolf urged him. "Take your woman and go while we draw them off. This is all I can give you, a chance. Do not waste it." White Crow gripped the older man's shoulder. "You were a good teacher," he said simply. "I taught you too well." Grey Wolf replied with something that might have been a sad smile. "Now go. Ride hard and do not look back." White Crow didn't need to be told twice. He was at the cleft in moments, pulling Sarah out. "Now," he said urgently, while they create a distraction. They ran for the horses as shouts erupted behind them, the warriors deliberately showing themselves to the soldiers, drawing their attention. Gunfire cracked through the air, but it was aimed away from them. Sarah and White Crow mounted and plunged down the backside of the mesa, using paths that made Sarah's stomach lurch. Behind them, the sounds of conflict grew, the warriors leading the soldiers on a chase through the stone maze, buying them precious time with their own freedom, perhaps their lives. They rode through the night again, but differently now. Not the panicked flight of the hunted, but the steady progress of those who had been given a gift of time. The pursuit was broken, at least for now. Grey Wolf and the others would not betray which direction they had gone. As dawn broke over empty grassland, White Crow finally called a halt. They had reached a small valley with good water and shelter, invisible from the plains unless you knew where to look. Sarah half fell from her horse, exhaustion hitting her like a physical weight. White Crow caught her, held her steady. "Grey Wolf," she said, her voice hoarse. "The others, will they—" "They are warriors," White Crow said. "They know these lands. They will escape or die fighting. Either way, they chose it." His voice roughened. "They chose to give us a chance." Sarah looked at him, this man who had given up everything, whose own mentor had risked death to help him escape. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for all of it, for what you've lost because of me." He cupped her face in his hands. "I have lost nothing that matters more than what I have found," he said simply. As the sun climbed higher, they made a simple camp in the hidden valley. They were fugitives now, truly alone, with dangers on every side, but they were free. The collar was gone. The pursuit was broken, and they had each other. It was, Sarah thought as exhaustion finally pulled her under, more than she had dared hope for in those dark nights as a captive. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough to build a future on. The abandoned trapper's cabin materialized from the mountainside like something from a dream. After 2 weeks of hard travel, sleeping under stars and jumping at every sound, the simple structure looked like a palace to Sarah's weary eyes. It was small, just one room with a stone fireplace, but the walls were solid, the roof mostly intact despite years of neglect. White Crow studied it carefully before approaching, checking for signs of recent occupation, finding none. He nodded. "This will do for now." They spent the first days making it livable. Sarah chinked gaps in the log walls with mud, while White Crow repaired the door hinges using strips of leather. Together they cleared debris from inside, laid fresh pine boughs for bedding, and gathered firewood for the coming cold. The work was hard but satisfying, building something together, creating shelter that was theirs alone. The cabin sat in a small meadow surrounded by towering pines, with a creek running clear and cold just 20 yards away. Mountains rose on 3 sides, providing protection and isolation. It was beautiful in its remoteness, terrifying in its solitude. On their 4th night in the cabin, as they sat by the fire sharing a meal of rabbit White Crow had snared, Sarah finally voiced what they'd both been avoiding. "Winter's coming." He nodded slowly. "Yes. Do we have enough supplies to last?" "We will manage." He gestured outside. "Game is plentiful here. The creek won't freeze completely. I can trap, hunt. You know how to preserve meat, make pemmican. I can learn." "Good." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "It will not be easy, but we will survive." Survival. It seemed like such a small goal, yet Sarah knew how monumental it truly was. 2 people alone in the wilderness, cut off from both their peoples, with winter approaching. Everything depended on their skills, their partnership, their trust in each other. As the days shortened and the air grew crisp, they fell into routines. White Crow hunted and set trap lines, bringing back deer, rabbits, even a small bear whose fat they rendered for cooking and waterproofing. Sarah learned to strip sinew for thread, to tan hides using the brain tanning method White Crow showed her, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs. In the evenings, they worked side by side, he fletching arrows or maintaining weapons while she sewed clothing from the hides they'd prepared. They talked during these quiet hours, sharing pieces of themselves that had been hidden before. "Tell me about your family," Sarah asked one night as her needle moved steadily through soft doeskin. White Crow's hands stilled on the arrow shaft he was smoothing. "My father was called Brave Horse. He died when I was 12 summers, fighting soldiers who came to move us from our hunting grounds. My mother tried to keep us together, but the spotted disease took her 2 winters later. I'm sorry." He resumed his work. "My grandfather raised us after that. My brother, my sister, and me. He was a peace chief, believed in finding ways to live alongside the whites. He taught us your language, said it would be important someday." A bitter smile touched his lips. He was right, though not in the way he meant. Sarah set down her sewing. "My father was a minister," she said softly. "He believed in bringing civilization to the frontier. When I married James and we headed west, he said we were doing God's work." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I wonder what he'd think of his daughter now." "You survived," White Crow said firmly. "There is no shame in that. Survived by breaking every rule I was raised with, living with a man who isn't my husband, wearing native clothing, learning heathen ways, as my father would say." White Crow moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. "Your God, is he not supposed to be everywhere? In all things?" "Yes." "Then he is here too, in these mountains, in the eagle's cry, in the deer that feeds us. Perhaps the rules of men are not the same as the rules of the Great Spirit, whatever name you call him by." It was a comfort she hadn't expected, this man who'd lost his own faith traditions understanding her spiritual struggle. That night, she kissed him by the fire, and this time, neither of them pulled away. Their relationship deepened as autumn progressed. What had begun as desperate alliance grew into genuine partnership, and from partnership into something richer. They learned each other's rhythms, strengths, fears. White Crow taught her to read weather signs, to move silently through forest, to shoot his bow when ammunition ran low. Sarah taught him to read the few books they'd found in the cabin, to write his name, to see the world through different eyes. But always, beneath the growing contentment, lay the ache of absence. "Tell me about Thomas," White Crow said one evening as early snow began to fall outside. They were wrapped in buffalo robes before the fire, Sarah leaning back against his chest. "He has a gap between his front teeth," Sarah said, smiling at the memory. "James used to say he could whistle through it like a songbird. He loves horses, even as a baby. He'd reach for them whenever we passed the livery." Her voice caught. "He used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. Said the thunder was giants bowling in heaven, and he didn't want to disturb their game by being alone." White Crow's arms tightened around her. "We will find him." "How? The Fox River Band could be anywhere, and even if we found them, why would they give him back? You said it yourself. Children adapt. He's probably forgotten English by now. Forgotten me. A child does not forget his mother's love," White Crow said firmly. "And I still have connections among the bands. When spring comes, when travel is safer, I will send word through traders. Quietly, carefully, we will learn where he is. And then we decide, together." He turned her to face him. "I promise you, Sarah, we will not give up on your son." The sincerity in his dark eyes broke something in her. She wept then, really wept. For the first time since her capture, not the silent tears of despair she'd shed as a slave, but the full-bodied sobs of grief finally acknowledged. White Crow held her through it, his own eyes suspiciously bright. When the storm passed, something had shifted between them. The last walls were down. That night, with snow falling softly outside and the fire crackling warmth, they became lovers in truth. It was gentle and fierce by turns, a claiming and a surrender, A promise made with bodies when words weren't enough. Afterward, they lay entwined, Sarah tracing the scars on his chest while he played with her hair. In my culture, White Crow said quietly, when a man and woman choose each other, they simply move their belongings into the same lodge. The family acknowledges it. The band accepts it. No ceremony needed beyond the choice itself. Sarah considered this. And in mine, without a minister and papers and witnesses, I'm living in sin. Does it feel like sin? She thought of all the teachings of her youth, the strict morality her father had preached. Then she thought of the cruelty she'd witnessed from supposedly civilized people, and the kindness from this man they would call savage. No, she said finally. It feels like grace. Winter arrived in earnest, sealing them into their mountain refuge. The snows came heavy and often, drifting up to the windows. They ventured out only for necessity, to check trap lines, gather firewood, hunt when fresh meat ran low. The rest of the time they spent in the warm cocoon of the cabin, creating a world of their own. Sarah learned to bead in the style of White Crow's people, decorating the shirts she made for him. He carved her small animals from wood, a horse for courage, a bear for strength, a crow for the connection between them. They told stories through the long nights, his tales of Coyote the trickster mixing with her memories of fairy tales and Bible stories. We're like Adam and Eve, she said one night, watching the firelight play across the log walls, alone in our own Eden. Except we chose our exile, White Crow pointed out. And I do not think your God will cast us out for eating rabbit stew instead of apples. She laughed, marveling that she could find humor in their situation. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps this is exactly where we're meant to be. But even in their contentment, they both knew it couldn't last forever. Spring would come, and with it, decisions. The outside world hadn't vanished simply because they'd fled to the mountains. Somewhere, Thomas was growing older without his mother. Somewhere, White Crow's people mourned him as dead or worse. Somewhere, the authorities might still be looking for an escaped captive and the warrior who'd freed her. For now, though, there was peace. There was warmth and companionship, and love discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. There was hope. One night, as a blizzard howled outside, White Crow pulled out a small pouch he'd kept hidden. From it, he produced 2 rings carved from deer antler, polished until they gleamed like ivory in the firelight. I made these, he said quietly. In my world and yours, they mean the same thing. Will you wear one? Sarah's throat tightened. Are you asking? I am asking if you will be my wife, in whatever way the spirits recognize. Here in this cabin, with the mountains as witness and the storm as our music, I am asking if you will face whatever comes next, not just as my companion, but as my family. She took the smaller ring with trembling fingers. It fit perfectly. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. They exchanged no vows that night. What words could encompass what they'd already proven through action? Instead, they simply slipped the rings on and held each other close while the storm raged outside. 2 souls who had found home in the most unexpected place, each other. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, it brought both beauty and danger. The melting snow revealed a world reborn, wildflowers pushing through dark soil, streams swollen with runoff, birds returning to fill the air with song. It also revealed tracks around their cabin that hadn't been there before winter sealed them in. Shod horses, White Crow said grimly, studying the prints. Perhaps a week old. 3 riders, moving slowly. They were looking for something. Sarah's hand went instinctively to the antler ring on her finger. Soldiers, maybe, or bounty hunters, or simply travelers. But his expression said he didn't believe the last option. They had known this day would come. Their mountain sanctuary couldn't hide them forever. Still, the evidence that the outside world was encroaching sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. That night, White Crow made a decision. I must go down to the trading post at Miller's Creek. We need supplies, ammunition, and I need to learn what news travels with the traders. I'll come with you. No. His tone was firm. Your face is too memorable. That hair, those eyes. If anyone is looking for a white woman who disappeared from captivity, you would be recognized immediately. Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Her appearance, even weathered by hardship and dressed in buckskin, was distinctive. How long? 3 days, 4 at most. He cupped her face. Bar the door at night. Keep the rifle close. If anyone comes, I know. She had learned to shoot over the winter. White Crow patiently teaching her until she could hit a target at 50 yards. Be careful. He left at dawn, taking the bay gelding and leaving her the faster paint mare. Sarah watched until he disappeared into the tree line, then turned back to the cabin that suddenly felt too empty. The first day passed quietly. She busied herself with chores, tending the small garden they'd planted, mending clothes, preparing meat for smoking. But her ears stayed alert for any unusual sound, her eyes scanning the forest edge. The second night, she woke to the sound of horses. Sarah lay perfectly still, barely breathing. Through the cabin's single window, moonlight showed 3 mounted figures at the edge of the meadow. They sat motionless, watching the cabin. One gestured, and they began to advance, moving silently. Sarah took the rifle and positioned herself by the window. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure they must hear it. The riders came closer, close enough that she could make out details. Worn cavalry uniforms, unkempt beards, the kind of hard faces that belonged to men who'd left military discipline behind for more profitable ventures. Deserters turned bounty hunters, the worst kind. One dismounted and approached the door. "Hello, the cabin?" he called. "We're looking for a lost woman, white woman, stolen by Indians last year. There's a reward for information." Sarah remained silent, hardly daring to breathe. The man knocked harder. "We know someone's in there. Seen your smoke. No harm in talking. Is there?" Still she said nothing. Through the window, she saw the other 2 men exchange glances. One started to circle around toward the back of the cabin. The front door shuddered as the first man threw his shoulder against it. The bar held, but it wouldn't for long. Sarah made a decision. She fired through the window, aiming high, a warning shot that shattered the still night. The men scrambled for cover, cursing. "That's unfriendly," the leader shouted. "We're just trying to help." "Get off my land," Sarah called back, disguising her voice as low and rough as she could manage. "Nothing here for you." "Now that's interesting," another voice said. "Man alone in the wilderness, shooting at honest travelers. Makes us wonder what you're hiding." They rushed the cabin then, all 3 at once. Sarah got off one more shot that sent splinters flying from the door frame before they crashed through. She swung the rifle like a club, catching one across the jaw. But there were too many. Rough hands seized her, and the rifle was torn away. The leader lit a lantern, and his eyes widened as the light fell on her face. Well, look what we have here." He grabbed her chin, forcing her head up. "You match the description perfectly. Sarah Mitchell, stolen from Willow Creek. There's quite a price on your return." "I'm not—" He backhanded her casually. "Don't lie. That brand on your shoulder tells the story, even if you've tried to hide it with savage markings." His eyes traveled over her buckskin dress, the beadwork she'd labored over, the antler ring. "Gone native, have you? No matter. Your husband's family wants you back, willing or not." "My husband is dead," Sarah spat. "His brother, then. Seems he inherited the farm and wants to inherit you, too. Something about Christian duty and saving your soul." The man's grin was ugly. "Pays in gold. He does." They bound her hands, ransacked the cabin. When they found White Crow's belongings, his war shirt, his weapons, their expressions grew calculating. Buck, who kept her, must be around somewhere. One said, "Maybe worth something too, dead or alive." Sarah's blood ran cold. They began searching outside, looking for signs of White Crow's direction. She had to warn him somehow. Had to. The arrow came from nowhere, taking the searcher through the shoulder. He screamed and fell before the others could react. White Crow materialized from the forest like an avenging spirit. He must have ridden hard, sensing something wrong. Now he moved with lethal purpose. Another arrow knocked. The leader grabbed Sarah, using her as a shield, pressing a knife to her throat. "Drop the bow! Savage!" he snarled. White Crow froze, his eyes meeting Sarah's. She saw him calculating, weighing her life against the odds. Slowly, he lowered the bow. "Good boy! Now!" Sarah drove her elbow back hard into her captor's ribs, twisting away from the knife. It was all the opening White Crow needed. His arrow flew true, catching the man in the chest. The third bounty hunter fired wildly with his pistol before White Crow's knife found him. In moments, it was over. Sarah stood shaking among the fallen men, blood spreading dark across the cabin floor. White Crow pulled her against him, checking her for injuries. "I'm all right," she gasped. "But they knew about me, about the reward." "We leave now," he said urgently. "Others will come looking when these don't return." They packed swiftly, taking only essentials. Sarah looked around the cabin that had been their haven, memorizing it, the fireplace where they'd spent winter evenings, the corner where their bed of furs had been, the table White Crow had built where they'd shared so many meals. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "There is nothing to apologize for." White Crow lifted her chin. "We knew this peace was temporary. Now we move." They rode through the night, but it was different from their initial flight. Then, they had been running from something. Now, White Crow had a destination in mind. "Where are we going?" "To find your son," he said simply. "I learned at the trading post. The Fox River Band is camped for spring gathering near the Mussel Shell River. 3 days' ride, if we push hard." Hope and fear warred in Sarah's chest. "But the risk. There is risk everywhere now. At least this risk has purpose." They rode for those 3 days like the wind itself, stopping only when the horses demanded it. White Crow led them along paths no white man knew, across rivers swollen with snowmelt, through passes that seemed impossible until suddenly they opened up. On the evening of the 3rd day, they sat their exhausted horses on a ridge overlooking a vast encampment. Hundreds of lodges spread along the river, smoke rising from cooking fires, the sound of drums carrying on the wind. "So many," Sarah breathed. "The spring gathering brings many bands together. Fox River will be among them." White Crow studied the camp with experienced eyes. "I cannot enter. Too many here would recognize me, know what I've done. But there is someone who might help." He led them to a smaller camp on the outskirts, where an old woman sat outside a modest lodge, working on a hide. She looked up at their approach, her weathered face showing no surprise. "Eagle Dreamer," White Crow said respectfully in Dakota. "I need your help." The old woman studied them both, her gaze lingering on Sarah. "White Crow, who broke the laws," she said in English, "and the woman he chose over his people. I wondered when you would come." "You know why we're here?" "The white boy with dark hair? Yes, I know." She set aside her work. "He lives with Dancing Crane and her husband. They love him as their own." Her eyes moved to Sarah. "He is well cared for, happy, even." Sarah's throat tightened. Would you take me to him?" Eagle Dreamer was quiet for a long moment. "The gathering is no place for you. White woman, even disguised, even with your hair covered, the anger runs deep this season. Too many battles, too many losses. Please," Sarah whispered. "I just need to see him, to know he's truly all right." The old woman looked at White Crow. "You ask much. I ask for compassion," he replied, "as you showed my sister when her children were taken." Eagle Dreamer sighed deeply. "Wait here." She rose and walked toward the main camp. Sarah and White Crow waited in tense silence, every moment stretching like hours. The sun was setting when Eagle Dreamer returned, and she was not alone. A small figure walked beside her, a boy with dark hair wearing buckskin leggings and a beaded shirt. He was taller than Sarah remembered, his face sun-browned, but she would have known him anywhere. "Thomas," she breathed. He looked up at the sound of his name, and their eyes met. For a moment, confusion crossed his features. Then something shifted, a memory surfacing, a recognition deeper than thought. "Mama?" His voice was uncertain, as if he didn't trust what he was seeing. Sarah slid from her horse, fell to her knees in the dust. "Yes, baby, it's me, it's Mama." He took a tentative step forward, then another, then he was running, flying across the distance between them. Sarah caught him against her, holding him as tight as she dared, breathing in his familiar scent beneath the smoke and leather. "I thought you were gone," he whispered against her neck. "They said you went to the spirit world." "No, my love, I've been looking for you. I never stopped looking." She pulled back to study his face, touching the new scar on his chin, the way his hair had been styled in the fashion of his adopted people. He was her Thomas still, but changed, adapted, survived. "Are they good to you?" she asked. "The family you live with?" He nodded slowly. "Dancing Crane says I'm the son the spirit sent to replace the one who died. She teaches me things, but I missed you. I tried not to, but I missed you so much." Sarah's heart broke and mended all at once. She looked up at Eagle Dreamer. "Is there any way?" The old woman's expression was compassionate, but firm. "Dancing Crane would die before giving him up, as would half the band. You are enemies to them. Even this meeting is dangerous." White Crow had remained mounted, keeping watch. Now he spoke quietly. "Riders coming." Eagle Dreamer moved quickly. "You must go. Now, before you're discovered." Sarah clutched Thomas tighter. How could she let him go again? How could she ride away and leave her child? Thomas pulled back slightly, his young face serious. "Are you safe, Mama? Are you happy?" Sarah glanced at White Crow, then back at her son. "Yes, my love. I found someone who takes care of me. We have a good life." "Then I can be happy too," Thomas said with the simple wisdom of children. "Dancing Crane says the spirits sometimes separate families so they can cover more of the earth with love. Maybe that's what happened to us." Sarah was crying now, unable to stop the tears. "My brave boy, my sweet, brave boy. Go," Eagle Dreamer urged. "I will bring him to the trading post at Miller's Creek each moon when it's full. You can see each other there, safer than here." It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Sarah kissed Thomas's forehead, memorizing everything about this moment. "I love you," she whispered. "Never forget that. No matter where you are or who you become, you are my son, and I love you." "I love you too, Mama." White Crow had brought the paint mare closer. Sarah forced herself to mount, forced herself not to look back as they rode away. But she heard Thomas call out one more time, "Be happy, Mama, be happy." They rode hard into the darkness, Sarah sobbing against White Crow's back as he led them away from danger. Her son was alive, loved, cared for. She had held him, heard his voice, seen his smile. It was more than she had dared hope for, and less than her mother's heart could bear. But he was safe. And perhaps, in this broken world where families were scattered like seeds on the wind, that was the greatest gift she could give him, the freedom to be happy where he was, knowing he was loved where he came from. The moon rose full and bright above them as they rode toward an uncertain future, but one they would face together, behind them, somewhere in that vast camp. A small boy with dark hair looked at the same moon and whispered a prayer for his mother's happiness. In whatever language the heart speaks when love transcends all boundaries. They rode for 2 days before finding the settlement, if it could even be called that. 3 buildings huddled against a riverbank where the mountains gave way to prairie. A trading post, a stable, and what might generously be termed a boarding house. Moss Landing, according to the faded sign, though there was precious little moss and no proper landing to speak of. "It's not much," White Crow said, studying the ramshackle structures. "It's perfect," Sarah replied. After weeks of running, anywhere that didn't require looking over their shoulders seemed like paradise. The trader, a grizzled man named Ezra Moss, who'd apparently named the place after himself, barely glanced at them when they entered his post. Mixed couples weren't common. But here at the edge of nowhere, he'd clearly seen stranger things. "Need supplies," White Crow said simply. "Got money?" White Crow produced a small pouch of gold coins, payment from pelts he'd traded months ago, saved for emergencies. Ezra's demeanor warmed considerably. "Stay as long as you like," he said. "Room upstairs if you need it. $1 a week. Meals included if you ain't particular about what you're eating." They took the room, a sparse but clean space with an actual bed and a window overlooking the river. Sarah sank onto the straw mattress with a sigh of relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could simply stop. Days turned into weeks as they recovered from their ordeal. White Crow found work at the stable, his skill with horses making him invaluable. Sarah helped Ezra's wife, Martha, with cooking and cleaning for the few travelers who passed through. It wasn't much, but it was honest work that earned them meals and a place to belong. However, temporarily. The other residents of Moss Landing were a motley crew. A few prospectors who'd given up on finding gold, a traveling preacher who'd lost his congregation, a woman who claimed to be a widow but had likely never been married. None of them asked questions about Sarah's tanned skin or native dress, or about the antler ring she wore. Everyone here had a past they'd rather not discuss. On full moon nights, Sarah and White Crow would ride to Miller's Creek, a day's journey away. Eagle Dreamer always kept her word, bringing Thomas to the trading post there. These meetings were bittersweet, joy at seeing her son mixed with the pain of parting. But each time, Thomas seemed more settled, more integrated into his new life. He was learning to track, to ride, to speak Lakota as fluently as English. Dancing Crane had even given him a name, Little Wolf, for his fierce protection of the younger children. "She says I might be a warrior someday," Thomas told them during one visit, his eyes bright with pride. Sarah exchanged glances with White Crow. Her Quaker upbringing recoiled at the thought of her son as a warrior, but she saw the confidence in his bearing, the strength growing in his young frame. He was becoming who he needed to be to survive in his world. "Whatever you become," she told him, "be good and be kind. That's all I ask." Summer faded into autumn, and Sarah realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks but hadn't dared hope. Now, with Martha Moss confirming her suspicions with the wisdom of a woman who'd birthed 8 children, it was real. When she told White Crow, he stood frozen for so long she feared he was upset. Then he dropped to his knees before her, pressing his face against her still flat belly. "A child," he whispered in wonder. "Our child. Are you happy?" He looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I had given up hope of family. My line, I thought, would die with me. But now," he placed his hand gently over her stomach, "now there will be someone who carries both our people's blood, a bridge between worlds." They began to plan more seriously then. Moss Landing was too exposed, too likely to draw attention as it grew. They needed somewhere more permanent, more protected. Ezra, who'd grown fond of them over the months, offered a solution. "Got a brother up near the Canadian border," he said one evening over dinner. "Runs a small ranch, nothing fancy. He's getting old, needs help, might be willing to take on partners, especially if they're good with horses." He gave White Crow a meaningful look. "It's remote, the kind of place where folks mind their own business." It seemed too good to be true, but when White Crow rode north to investigate, he returned with good news. The ranch was real, the offer genuine. Jacob Moss was indeed aging and welcomed the prospect of help, especially from someone who knew horses as well as White Crow did. They prepared to leave as winter approached. But first, there was one more meeting with Thomas. This time, he seemed to sense something different. "You're going away, aren't you?" he asked Sarah as they sat together by the trading post fire. "Not away," she said carefully. "Just farther north, somewhere safe where we can build a proper home for the baby," Thomas said matter-of-factly. At Sarah's startled look, he grinned. "Dancing Crane's sister looks the same way. I know about babies." Sarah pulled him close. "You'll always be my first baby. Nothing changes that. I know, Mama." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What if I can't visit anymore?" White Crow spoke up. "When you're older, if you choose, you can find us. I'll leave word with traders, a map with Eagle Dreamer. The choice will be yours." Thomas nodded solemnly, understanding more than any child his age should have to. When they parted this time, Sarah felt a strange peace. Her son was growing up strong and capable. He had love, family, purpose, and someday, if the spirits willed it, their paths might cross again. The journey north took 3 weeks through increasingly wild country. Sarah rode carefully, protective of the life growing within her. When they finally reached the ranch, a modest but sturdy collection of buildings in a valley surrounded by forested hills, she felt something settle in her chest. This could be home. Jacob Moss was everything his brother had promised, gruff but fair, more interested in hard work than asking questions. He took one look at White Crow's way with horses and Sarah's determined efficiency and nodded approval. "Room in the back of the house is yours," he said simply. "We'll work out the partnership details come spring." They settled in as snow began to fall, making the valley their own. White Crow built furniture with the same care he'd once crafted arrows. Sarah planted an indoor herb garden, made curtains for their windows, created a nest for the child to come, on the wall. She hung the broken iron collar, not as a reminder of captivity, but of freedom earned. The local town was a full day's ride away, and their nearest neighbors even farther. When Sarah's pregnancy became obvious, the few people they encountered assumed they were married. The antler rings served as wedding bands, and if anyone noticed their unusual design, they didn't comment. Out here, survival mattered more than propriety. Spring brought new life in multiple ways. The ranch prospered under White Crow's care, the horse herd growing strong, and on a night when the moon rose full and bright, Sarah gave birth to a daughter with her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes. They named her Hope in English for Sarah's heritage, and in Dakota, Wasichu Win, meaning new beginning. She was a bridge indeed. This child born of two worlds, carrying the possibility of a future neither of her parents could have imagined. As Sarah recovered, holding her daughter while White Crow played soft melodies on a flute he'd carved, she thought about the journey that had brought them here, the violence and loss, the captivity and flight, the impossible choices and unexpected grace. She touched the tattoo on her shoulder, the White Crow breaking free, and understood that every moment had led to this, a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice, sacrifice, and love. "Do you regret it?" she asked White Crow one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Hope slept peacefully in her arms, and somewhere to the south, Thomas was probably helping with evening chores in his adopted family's lodge. Regret what? Everything you gave up, your people, your place among them, your whole world, all for... She gestured helplessly at herself. Their life, everything it had cost him. White Crow was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the antler ring. "I traded one world for another," he said finally. "But look what I gained. A wife who sees me not as savage or civilized, but simply as a man. A daughter who will grow up knowing both traditions, forced to choose neither. A son who, though not of my blood, I helped save by saving his mother. And this," he gestured at the valley, the ranch, the life they'd built. "This place where we can be ourselves, not what others demand we be. It's not the life either of us expected." Sarah said, "No." White Crow agreed. "It's better, because we chose it." As if in agreement, Hope stirred and made a small sound of contentment. Sarah adjusted her position, and the movement caught the light on her shoulder, not the ugly brand of ownership it had once been, but the beautiful mark of transformation it had become. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, two people who had crossed impossible boundaries to find each other. In the distance, a crow called, not white, perhaps, but free nonetheless. Sarah smiled and leaned against White Crow's shoulder. She had been collared in iron and marked as property, deemed less than human by those who claimed superiority. But love, stubborn, defiant, revolutionary love, had broken every chain meant to bind her. A Dakota warrior had risked everything to save her, not because she was white or native, civilized or savage, but because she was human and deserved to be free. And in the end, that was the greatest triumph of all. Not just survival, but the audacity to thrive, to build a life on their own terms, to raise children who would know that courage comes in many forms, that family is what you make it, and that sometimes the most profound act of rebellion is simply to love without permission. The stars came out one by one above their valley, and Sarah Mitchell, former captive, grieving mother, unlikely wife, closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the broken road that had led her home. Thank you for listening to this story of love and survival in the Wild West. If you've made it this far, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment and let's connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Sarah and White Crow's journey. What touched your heart? What surprised you? Your stories and reactions make these tales come alive. Until next time, partners.